Venezuela forces an uncomfortable truth. Let me take you back to the morning of January 10, 2024. Nicolas Maduro, standing before Venezuela's Supreme Court, delivered a speech that barely registered in Western headlines. He announced that Venezuela would formally annex the Essequibo, a 160,000 square kilometer territory currently administered by Guyana, rich in oil, gold, and untapped mineral wealth. The move was framed as a historic reclamation of land Venezuela had long claimed, but the timing was no coincidence. Just weeks earlier, ExxonMobil had announced another major offshore oil discovery in the disputed waters, and Guyana's GDP growth had hit an eye-watering 38%, the highest in the world. Maduro's gambit wasn't just about nationalism, it was a calculated play to redirect domestic anger over Venezuela's economic collapse toward an external enemy. At first glance, this looks like another chapter in the long, sad story of Latin American caudillismo, strongmen playing to the gallery while their countries burn. The official narrative, the one you've probably heard, goes something like Venezuela, a rogue state run by a dictator, is bullying its tiny neighbor Guyana over a territorial dispute that was settled by international arbitration in 1899. The U.S. and its allies have condemned the move, dispatched naval patrols to the region, and reaffirmed their support for Guyana's sovereignty. The UK, which once ruled the territory, has even sent a warship to the area as a show of force. The message is the West stands with democracy and the rule of law against authoritarian actionism. But there's a problem with this narrative. It's not wrong, exactly. Maduro is a dictator, Venezuela is a failing state, and Guyana does have a legitimate claim to the Essequibo under international law. The problem is that this framing obscures the deeper geopolitical currents at play. What we're witnessing isn't just a local dispute, it's a microcosm of the new Cold War, a test of American resolve in a multipolar world, and a warning of the dangers ahead when great powers collide over the carcass of a collapsing state. I've spent the last 3 decades studying the intersection of resource politics, great power competition, and the unraveling of the post-Cold War order. And let me tell you, what's happening in Venezuela right now is far more significant than most people realize. This isn't just about oil. It's about the future of American hegemony, the limits of military power, and the uncomfortable truth that the U.S. is no longer the undisputed arbiter of global affairs. The official what they want you to believe. The story, as it's being told in Washington, London, and Brussels, is straightforward. Venezuela, under Maduro's authoritarian rule, is attempting to distract from its domestic crises by manufacturing a foreign conflict. The Essequibo dispute, we're told, is a cynical ploy to rally nationalist sentiment and deflect attention from hyperinflation, mass emigration, and the regime's brutal repression of dissent. The U.S. has responded with a mix of diplomatic pressure and military posturing, sending the USS Burlington to conduct joint exercises with the Guyanese military, imposing new sanctions on Venezuelan officials, and reaffirming its commitment to defend Guyana under the Rio Treaty. The numbers seem to support this narrative. Venezuela's economy has shrunk by 75% since 2013. More than 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country, creating one of the worst refugee crises in modern history. Maduro's approval ratings hover around 20%, and his government survives only through the systematic dismantling of democratic institutions and the jailing or exile of opposition leaders. Meanwhile, Guyana's oil boom has transformed it into the fastest-growing economy on Earth, with ExxonMobil and other Western firms pouring billions into offshore drilling. From this perspective, Venezuela's aggression looks like the desperate flailing of a regime with nothing left to lose. The media has largely echoed this framing. The New York Times ran a piece titled "Venezuela's Maduro Stirs Up a Border Dispute to Distract from His Failures," while The Economist described the Essequibo crisis as a gambit by a desperate dictator. Even the usually sober Financial Times framed the conflict as a straightforward case of resource nationalism run amok. The implicit message is that this is a containable problem, one that can be managed with a mix of sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and the occasional show of military force. But here's where the official narrative starts to unravel. Deconstructing the what's really happening. Let's start with the facts that don't fit. First, Venezuela's claim to the Essequibo isn't entirely baseless. The 1899 arbitration award that granted the territory to British Guiana was, by all accounts, a sham, a backroom deal between imperial powers that ignored local realities. Venezuela has never fully accepted the ruling, and in 1966, just months before Guyana's independence, the UK and Venezuela signed the Geneva Agreement, which called for a negotiated settlement. The dispute has simmered ever since, but it's only now, with Guyana's oil boom, that it's become explosive. Second, Maduro's move isn't just about domestic politics. It's about survival. Venezuela's oil production has collapsed from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1998 to just 700,000 today. The country's refineries are in ruins, its infrastructure is crumbling, and its people are starving. But the Essequibo isn't just any patch of land, it's home to an estimated 11 billion barrels of oil, much of it in shallow waters that are far easier to exploit than Venezuela's own heavy crude deposits. If Maduro can secure even a portion of that territory, he gains a lifeline for his regime. And if he can't? Well, then he at least ensures that Guyana's oil wealth doesn't become a tool for Western energy dominance in the region. Third, and most importantly, this isn't just about Venezuela and Guyana. It's about the broader struggle for influence in Latin America, a region that the US has long considered its backyard but where China and Russia have been making inroads for years. China is now Guyana's largest foreign investor, having poured billions into infrastructure projects. Russia, meanwhile, has been Venezuela's most reliable ally, supplying arms, intelligence support, and even mercenaries from the Wagner Group to prop up Maduro's regime. When Maduro announced the annexation of the Essequibo, he didn't just do it alone. He did it with the backing of Moscow and Beijing, who see this as an opportunity to challenge American influence in the Western Hemisphere. Now, let me be, I'm not saying Maduro is some kind of geopolitical mastermind. He's not. He's a former bus driver who stumbled into power and has spent the last decade presiding over one of the greatest economic collapses in modern history. But what he is doing is exploiting a moment of American distraction. The US is bogged down in Ukraine, facing a potential crisis in the Taiwan Strait, and dealing with a domestic political landscape so polarized that coherent foreign policy is nearly impossible. Maduro knows that the US can't afford another front, and he's testing how far he can push before Washington is forced to respond. And that's where things get really dangerous. The X did geopolitical a new Cold War in the Americas. To understand why this matters, you have to out. We're living in an era of great power competition, but it's not the same as the Cold War. Back then, the world was divided into two clear blocks, with the US and USSR carving up spheres of influence. Today, the competition is more fluid, more economic, and far more dangerous because there are no clear rules. China and Russia aren't trying to export communism, they're trying to rewrite the global order in a way that diminishes American power. And they're doing it by exploiting the gaps in US strategy, particularly in regions like Latin America, where Washington's attention has been sporadic at best. Let's talk about China first. Over the last 2 decades, Beijing has become the dominant economic player in Latin America, displacing the US as the top trading partner for countries like Brazil, Chile, and Peru. Chinese loans to the region now exceed those from the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank combined. And it's not just about trade. China has built ports, railroads, and 5G networks across the continent, creating dependencies that give it leverage over local governments. In Guyana, Chinese firms are already involved in offshore oil projects, and Beijing has made it clear that it sees the country as a key partner in its Belt and Road Initiative. Russia, meanwhile, has taken a different approach. While China focuses on economics, Russia plays the role of the spoiler, arming leftist governments, meddling in elections, and providing diplomatic cover for regimes that the US wants to isolate. In Venezuela, Russia has been Maduro's lifeline. It supplied fighter jets, surface-to-air missiles, and even cybersecurity support to help the regime crack down on dissent. When the US imposed sanctions on Venezuela's oil industry, Russia stepped in, buying up Venezuelan crude at discounted prices and helping Caracas evade restrictions. And when Maduro announced the annexation of the Essequibo, it was Russian state media that first amplified the claim, framing it as a legitimate act of resistance against Western imperialism. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The US has spent the last 2 years hyper-focused on Ukraine, pouring over $100 billion into the war effort. That's money and attention that could have gone toward shoring up alliances in Latin America, but instead, the region has been left to drift. And while the US has been distracted, China and Russia have been making moves. In 2022, Honduras switched diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to China. In 2023, Nicaragua signed a security pact with Russia, allowing Moscow to station troops and warships in the country. And now, with Venezuela's aggression in the Essequibo, we're seeing the first major test of whether the US is still willing to enforce its red lines in its own hemisphere. The uncomfortable truth is that the US is losing influence in Latin America, and it's losing it because it's been outmaneuvered. Washington still thinks in terms of military alliances and ideological blocs, but China and Russia are playing a different game, one that's about economics, infrastructure, and the slow erosion of American dominance. And Venezuela? It's just the latest battleground in that struggle. Military and strategic, the illusion of quick solutions. So, what happens next? The US has already sent military advisors to Guyana and conducted joint naval exercises in the region. The UK has dispatched the HMS Trent, a patrol vessel, to the area. And there's talk of deeper sanctions, cyber operations, and even covert action to destabilize Maduro's regime. But here's the: none of these options are as straightforward as they seem. Let's start with the military angle. The US could, in theory, use force to deter Venezuela. A show of naval power, a few airstrikes on Venezuelan military installations, maybe even a limited ground incursion to secure key oil fields. But here's the: Venezuela isn't Iraq in 2003. It's not a weak state with a hollowed-out military. It's a country with a battle-hardened army, Russian air defenses, and a population that, while exhausted, still harbors deep resentment toward the US for decades of intervention. And even if the US could quickly defeat Venezuela's military, which is far from guaranteed, the real challenge would be what comes in. We've seen this movie before. In Iraq, the US toppled Saddam Hussein in 3 weeks, only to spend the next 2 decades mired in a counterinsurgency war. In Libya, NATO's intervention in 2011 led to state collapse and a decade of chaos. In Afghanistan, the US spent 20 years trying to build a stable government, only to see the Taliban retake the country in a matter of weeks. The lesson? Military power is easy to deploy but nearly impossible to translate into lasting political outcomes. And in Venezuela, where the opposition is fractured and the regime has spent years purging dissent, the risks of a prolonged conflict are even higher. Then there's the question of escalation. Venezuela isn't acting alone. Russia has already warned that any US military action would be met with a proportional response. What does that mean? It could mean cyber attacks on US infrastructure, or arms shipments to anti-American groups in the region, or even a deeper Russian military presence in Venezuela. And China? Beijing has been careful not to overtly support Maduro's annexation, but it's also made it clear that it opposes any US intervention. If the US gets bogged down in Venezuela, China could use the distraction to make a move on Taiwan. That's the nightmare scenario for a two-front crisis where the US is stretched thin and its adversaries sense weakness. Now, I'm not saying the US should do nothing. But what I am saying is that the hawks in Washington who think this can be solved with a quick military strike are dangerously naive. The last 3 decades have shown that the US is very good at starting wars but very bad at ending them. And in a region as volatile as Latin America, where anti-American sentiment runs deep, the risks of miscalculation are enormous. The domestic political why this matters in Washington. But this isn't just about geopolitics. It's also about domestic politics. And in Washington, domestic politics always trumps foreign policy. Let's be: the Biden administration doesn't want another crisis. It's already dealing with Ukraine, the Middle East, and the looming threat of a Trump comeback in 2024. The last thing it needs is a new front in Latin America, especially one that could alienate key voter blocs. Florida, for example, is home to a large Venezuelan exile community that despises Maduro and would love to see the US take a harder line. But it's also home to a growing Latino population that's increasingly skeptical of US interventionism. The administration is walking a tightrope, trying to appear tough on Venezuela without committing to a course of action that could backfire. Then there's the Republican side. The GOP has been pushing for a more aggressive stance on Venezuela for years, framing Maduro as a threat to US security and calling for regime change. But here's the same Republicans who want to bomb Venezuela also want to cut off aid to Ukraine and reduce U.S. military commitments abroad. It's a contradictory position, but it's one that plays well with the party's base, which is increasingly isolationist but still hawkish on issues like immigration and drug trafficking, both of which are tied to Venezuela's collapse. And let's not forget the role of the defense industry. Every time the U.S. gets involved in a new conflict, the military-industrial complex stands to profit. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman all have a vested interest in keeping the U.S. engaged in global hotspots, and Venezuela is no exception. The more unstable the region becomes, the more the U.S. will spend on military hardware, intelligence operations, and private security contractors. It's a self-perpetuating cycle, and one that's hard to break. So, what does this mean for U.S. policy? It means that the response to Venezuela will be shaped more by domestic political calculations than by strategic logic. The Biden administration will likely opt for a middle path: sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and limited military support for Guyana while avoiding any action that could escalate into a full-blown conflict. But that approach has its own risks. If Maduro senses weakness, he'll push harder. And if he succeeds in annexing even a portion of the Essequibo, it will embolden other revisionist states to challenge the status quo. Scenario: what comes next? So, where do we go from here? Let's look at the possible scenarios, because none of them are good. Scenario 1, the best case. In this scenario, the U.S. and its allies manage to deter Venezuela through a combination of diplomatic pressure and military posturing. Maduro backs down, the status quo is preserved, and Guyana's oil boom continues unabated. The U.S. avoids a direct confrontation, and the crisis fades from the headlines. This is the outcome that Washington is hoping for, but it's also the least likely. Maduro has already burned his bridges with the West, and he knows that backing down now would be political suicide. He's not going to retreat unless he's forced to. Scenario 2, the most likely. This is the scenario where things get messy but don't spiral out of control. Venezuela makes a limited incursion into the Essequibo, maybe seizing a small border town or an offshore oil platform, and the U.S. responds with targeted sanctions, cyber attacks, and covert support for opposition groups. Russia and China condemn the U.S. but stop short of direct intervention. The conflict becomes a frozen one, like Kashmir or Cyprus, where neither side can claim victory but neither is willing to back down. Guyana's oil production continues, but at a slower pace, and Venezuela's economy remains in shambles. This is the most probable outcome, but it's also the most unstable, because it leaves the door open for future escalation. Scenario 3, the worst case. In this scenario, the crisis escalates into a full-blown regional conflict. Venezuela, emboldened by Russian and Chinese support, launches a larger military operation to seize key oil fields. The U.S. responds with airstrikes on Venezuelan military installations, and Russia retaliates by increasing its military presence in the region. China, sensing an opportunity, accelerates its investments in Guyana and other Latin American countries, further undermining U.S. influence. The conflict spreads, drawing in other actors: Colombia, Brazil, even Cuba, and before long, the U.S. finds itself bogged down in another endless war. This is the nightmare scenario, and while it's not the most likely, it's the one that keeps me up at night. Grand strategy: the unraveling of American hegemony. Now, let's out even further. What does Venezuela tell us about the broader state of American power? For the last 3 decades, the U.S. has operated under the assumption that it can maintain its global dominance through a combination of military superiority, economic leverage, and ideological appeal. This is what scholars call Lee Barrel hegemony, the idea that the U.S. could reshape the world in its image through institutions like the IMF, NATO, and the World Bank, while keeping challengers like Russia and China in check through a mix of containment and engagement. But Venezuela's defiance, and the broader unraveling of American influence in Latin America, suggests that this model is no longer working. The uncomfortable truth is that the U.S. is no longer the undisputed hegemon it once was, and its ability to shape outcomes in its own backyard is eroding faster than most policymakers in Washington are willing to admit. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about a fundamental shift in the global balance of power, one that's been building for years but is now accelerating. Let me explain why this matters. For decades, the US treated Latin America as its sphere of influence, a region where it could intervene at will, whether through coups, sanctions, or outright invasions. Think of Guatemala in 1954, Chile in 1973, or AMA in 1989. But today, that playbook is obsolete. The rise of China as a major economic player in the region, Russia's growing military and diplomatic footprint, and the resurgence of leftist governments in countries like Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia have created a multipolar dynamic that the US can no longer control. Take China, for example. In 2000, China's trade with Latin America was a mere $12 billion. By 2022, it had ballooned to over $450 billion, making China the region's second largest trading partner after the US. Beijing isn't just buying commodities, it's investing in infrastructure, energy, and technology, often with fewer strings attached than Washington's offers. In Guyana, China has already secured contracts for offshore oil exploration, and if Venezuela were to seize the Essequibo, Beijing would likely step in to protect its investments, further complicating US efforts to isolate Caracas. This isn't just economic competition, it's a direct challenge to American primacy in what was once considered its backyard. Russia, too, has been playing a long game. Since the early 2000s, Moscow has cultivated relationships with leftist governments in the region, offering military aid, energy deals, and diplomatic support. Venezuela is the most obvious example. Russia has provided billions in loans, military equipment, and even deployed nuclear-capable bombers to the country in a show of force. But it's not just Venezuela. Russia has also deepened ties with Nicaragua, Cuba, and Bolivia, and in 2023, it signed a military cooperation agreement with Honduras. The message is Moscow is here to stay, and it's willing to challenge US influence in ways that would have been unthinkable during the Cold War. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is losing its grip on Latin America, and it doesn't have a coherent strategy to respond. The Biden administration has tried to counter China's influence with initiatives like the Americas Partnership for Economic Prosperity, but these efforts have been underfunded and lack the urgency of Beijing's investments. Meanwhile, the US continues to rely on sanctions and military posturing, tools that may have worked in the past but are increasingly ineffective in a region where countries are diversifying their alliances and asserting their sovereignty. But the military implications of this shift are even more alarming. For the first time since the Cold War, the US is facing the prospect of a peer competitor operating in its own hemisphere. Russia's deployment of nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in 2018 was a direct challenge to US regional dominance, and China's growing military presence in the Pacific, including its base in Djibouti and potential future bases in Latin America, suggests that the Pentagon's long-held assumption of uncontested access to the Western Hemisphere is no longer valid. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the erosion of the Monroe Doctrine, the 19th-century policy that declared the Americas off-limits to foreign powers. For generations, the US has treated Latin America as its exclusive domain, intervening whenever it saw fit. But today, Russia and China are openly defying that doctrine, and the US is struggling to respond. The problem isn't just that Washington lacks the tools to counter these challenges, it's that it lacks the political will. The American public is war-weary, and Congress is deeply divided, making it nearly impossible to craft a coherent strategy for the region. So where does this leave us? If we're being honest, the US is in a position it hasn't been in since the 19th, a great power with declining influence in its own neighborhood. Venezuela's gambit in the Essequibo is just the latest symptom of this broader trend. The question is whether Washington will recognize the new reality in time to adapt, or whether it will continue to cling to outdated assumptions about its own dominance, even as the world moves on without it. Now, what most people don't realize is that this geopolitical shift isn't happening in a vacuum. It's being driven by the collapse of Venezuela's domestic political order, and that collapse is far from over. The Maduro regime's survival isn't just a story of authoritarian resilience, it's a case study in how a state can weaponize chaos to maintain power while the rest of the world either looks away or fails to act decisively. And if we're being honest, the US and its allies have played a significant role in enabling this dysfunction, not just through sanctions but through a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern authoritarianism actually works. Let me explain why this matters. When Hugo Chavez first took power in 1999, he didn't just inherit a country with oil wealth, he inherited a state that was already deeply corrupt, clientelistic, and dependent on petrodollars. But Chavez, for all his flaws, understood something. In a country where the state had always been weak outside the capital, he could use oil money to buy loyalty, not just from the military but from the poorest sectors of society. The misiones, the social programs that provided healthcare, education, and subsidized food, weren't just welfare, they were a political tool, a way to embed the revolution in the daily lives of millions. By the time Chavez died in 2013, Venezuela wasn't just a petrostate, it was a petropopulist state, where the government's legitimacy was tied to its ability to distribute rents, not to democratic institutions or the rule of law. Maduro, of course, was never Chavez. He lacked the charisma, the strategic vision, and most critically, the oil money to sustain the system. By 2014, global oil prices had collapsed, and Venezuela's production, already hobbled by mismanagement, began its freefall. The state's revenue plummeted by more than 60% between 2014 and 2016, according to OPEC data. But instead of adjusting, Maduro doubled down. He printed money, triggering hyperinflation that peaked at over 1,000,000% in 2018. He purged the military of potential rivals, replacing them with loyalists who had a direct stake in the regime's survival, often through control of smuggling routes, gold mines, or the lucrative bachacao. And he allowed the state to hollow itself out, outsourcing basic functions to Cuban intelligence operatives, Russian mercenaries, and Chinese state-owned enterprises. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro's regime isn't just surviving, it's thriving in its own perverse way. The sanctions that were supposed to strangle the government have instead created a parallel economy where the regime and its cronies control the flow of dollars, food, and fuel. The U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control has sanctioned over 150 Venezuelan individuals and entities since 2017, but as the UN's own reports have shown, these measures have done little to stop the regime's illicit gold trade or its deals with Chinese and Russian firms. In fact, they've made the regime more dependent on those external actors, because the sanctions have cut off Venezuela's access to Western financial systems, forcing it into the arms of Beijing and Moscow. Now, let's talk about the opposition, because this is where the story gets even more frustrating. For years, the US and its European allies have bet on Juan Guaidó as the legitimate leader of Venezuela, recognizing him as interim president in 2019. But Guaidó's strategy, relying on international pressure, sanctions, and the hope of a military uprising, has failed spectacularly. The reason? The opposition has never had a coherent plan to address the regime's core: its control over the military and the informal economy. Guaidó's team assumed that if they could just cut off Maduro's access to dollars, the generals would turn on him. But those generals aren't just loyal to Maduro, they're loyal to the system that keeps them rich. And as long as they can still smuggle gold, sell oil to China, and traffic cocaine to Europe, they have no incentive to defect. The opposition's other mistake was assuming that the Venezuelan people would keep protesting indefinitely. They didn't account for the fact that after years of hyperinflation, food shortages, and state repression, most Venezuelans are too exhausted to take to the streets. The 2017 protests, which saw millions march against Maduro, were met with brutal crackdowns. Over 160 people were killed, and thousands were arrested. By 2020, the protests had fizzled out, not because Venezuelans suddenly loved Maduro, but because they had no faith that the opposition could deliver change. The regime understood this dynamic better than anyone. It didn't just repress dissent, it co-opted it, allowing controlled opposition figures like Enrique Capriles to run in sham elections, giving the illusion of pluralism while ensuring the outcome was never in doubt. So where does this leave us in terms of scenario projections? I see three possible paths forward, none of them particularly optimistic. The first is the status quo plus a slow-motion collapse where Maduro clings to power, the economy remains in tatters, and the regime becomes even more dependent on China and Russia. In this scenario, Venezuela doesn't become a failed state in the traditional sense, it becomes a mafia state, where the government functions primarily as a criminal enterprise. We're already seeing this with the rise of the Cartel de los Soles, the military-linked drug trafficking network that the US has accused of shipping cocaine to Europe with the help of Russian and Iranian operatives. If this path continues, we can expect more of the sporadic protests, more sanctions, and a steady stream of Venezuelan migrants, already over 7 million, according to the UN, fleeing to Colombia, the US, and beyond. The second scenario is a negotiated transition, but this is where things get tricky. The Maduro regime has shown time and again that it's willing to talk, but only on its own terms. The 2021 Barbados negotiations, mediated by Norway, collapsed when the regime arrested opposition figures mid-talks. The 2023 Qatar-mediated talks fared no better. The problem isn't just Maduro's intransigence, it's that the opposition is divided, and the US lacks leverage. The Biden administration has offered sanctions relief in exchange for free elections, but Maduro knows that the US is desperate to reduce migration and stabilize oil markets ahead of the 2024 election. He's playing a long game, betting that Washington will blink first. And he might be right. If the US eases sanctions without real concessions, it will only embolden the regime, not weaken it. The third scenario is the black swan, a sudden collapse triggered by an internal fracture within the military or a catastrophic economic shock. This is the scenario that keeps US policymakers up at night, because it's the one they're least prepared for. If the military splits, say, if a faction of generals decides Maduro is more of a liability than an asset, we could see a rapid unraveling. But this isn't 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed overnight. Venezuela's military is deeply enmeshed in the criminal economy, and any defection would likely be messy, violent, and prolonged. The last time Venezuela saw a serious coup attempt was in 2019, when a small group of soldiers tried to overthrow Maduro with the help of a US private security firm. It failed spectacularly, and the regime used it as an excuse to purge the military even further. The lesson? Maduro has learned from history. He's not going to make the same mistakes as Allende in Chile or Noriega in AMA. Here's the: none of these scenarios lead to a democratic Venezuela. The best-case outcome is a managed transition where the opposition and the regime agree to a power-sharing deal, but even that would likely leave the military and the Chavista elite in control of key institutions. The worst-case outcome is a prolonged civil conflict, where Venezuela becomes a battleground for foreign powers, Russia, China, Iran, and the US, each backing different factions. And in between, we have the slow-motion nightmare of a country that remains nominally independent but is effectively a client state of Beijing and Moscow. So what should the US do? The first step is to stop pretending that sanctions alone will work. The second is to recognize that the opposition, as currently constituted, is not a viable alternative to Maduro. And the third is to accept that Venezuela is no longer a US problem, it's a regional one, and it requires a regional solution. Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico have far more leverage with Maduro than Washington does, but they're also deeply divided. Colombia's President Gustavo Petro has taken a conciliatory approach, while Brazil's Lula has oscillated between condemning Maduro and defending him. Mexico, under AMLO, has been openly sympathetic to the regime. The uncomfortable truth is that the US has lost the initiative in Venezuela. It can either double down on a failed strategy or accept that the world has changed and adapt accordingly. The Monroe Doctrine is dead, but that doesn't mean the US has to abandon Latin America. It just means it has to start treating the region as a collection of sovereign states, not as its backyard. That will require humility, patience, and a willingness to work with partners who don't always share Washington's priorities. But if the US keeps clinging to the past, it will only accelerate its decline in the hemisphere, and that's a future no one should want.